We are honored today to have with us two truly distinguished senators, members of the United States Senate, Rob Portman of Ohio, Mark Warner of Virginia, and then Alan Krueger, the chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors. And they all, as you know, have had a long history of very serious involvement with the issues of evidence-based decision-making. I kind of think of it more as evidence-informed decision-making when you consider all the other factors involved. And all of them have had a lot of serious thought and involvement with the question of how to take values, non-quantifiable factors, and evidence to weigh benefits against costs to make for better decision-making, and that certainly is a critically important question when we're faced with the fiscal constraints that we will be faced with, I suspect, indefinitely. I won't repeat any of the materials in your packets. You have their distinguished careers in their resumes. Let me just make one observation, if I could, though. Each of these two distinguished senators has worked across party lines with members of the party to develop proposals and to try to move forward in these areas. And it seems to me that exemplifies the kind of bipartisan working to find common ground that we are going to have if our federal government is going to be effective in meeting the critical challenges that we face. With that, let me pose a question to each of the panelists, and then we'll have a discussion amongst all of us, and then we'll turn over the Q&A, question to discussion, to all of you. Let me start with Senator Portman. Rob, when you were head of OMB, and a very successful head of OMB, you did a great deal of work in this area, including your program assessment rating tool. When you did all this, how did you deal with the question of making this real and effective? That is to say, of instilling it in the cultures of the agencies with respect to their programs and with respect to their regulatory functions, instead of simply being or becoming very quickly paper filing and an impediment rather than an aid to better decision making?
Great question. And frankly, by the time I got there, the program was already up and going, which was great for me because part of the answer to your question is time. And it took some time. So I got there in 2006, and the PART program was already in place. And honestly, I think a lot of folks who had been in the agencies or departments for a while were sort of waiting for the next reform to come. Does that sound familiar? This too shall pass. But then people sort of got into it, and part of what we did is we tried to hold up the people at OMB. Are there any former OMB folks here, career folks? Raise your hand high.
I think you're quite a few.
I mean, it's the best and brightest. It really is a great group. And
I thought Treasury was, but that's okay.
We're leaner and meaner at OMB. It's only 500 people. I mean, it's a really small agency to have the oversight responsibilities and obviously put together the budget. But don't you think it's fair to say that we held people up who were in those positions? Because that was part of our issue, too, is how to get people at OMB excited about this. Kat Sunstein, who just left OIRA, wrote a book called Simpler recently, and he uses as a reference to this notion of evidence-based legislating or regulating, or I should say just programs, the example of Moneyball. And he talks about, is it Billy Bean? Yes. The manager who's the young guy who is sitting around with the scouts, and one of the scouts says, no, this guy's great, that guy's great, and he talks to one guy and goes, this guy's great, we got to bring him on. We got to trade for him, got to do him, because he's got a beautiful swing. He's got a great swing. Billy Bean says, oh great, he's got a great swing. He's such a good hitter. Why are his statistics so bad? It's like, he's such a great hitter, why doesn't he hit better? And this scout who's been at this for 50 years says, you just don't understand, it's all about how it looks, and so part of it is that mentality, it might look good and sound good, the program is well intended and all that, but at some point you have to say, okay, not just what's the input, but what's the outcome, what's actually happened, to change people's lives, and at a time of budget austerity, I know I'm not supposed to use that word, but I will, because that's what we're facing. We've got to be sure that every dollar is spent in the most efficient, effective way possible, and PART program is an example of it. Mark and I are doing some legislation together, as I think you know, Bob, with regard to agencies generally. This is the Accountability Act on encouraging cost-benefit analysis in a more rigorous way, more evidence-based, more transparency, also least burdensome alternative, and we also got one on independent agencies, which I think is very possible for us to get done in a bipartisan context. And then the Data Act, which I'll let Mark talk about, which is all about this, how to be sure that this information is not just out there in the agencies and departments, but the transparency. So part of the answer is time, part of the answer is the culture change. Part of the answer is, with PART, we actually put this stuff online. And I think that helps too, because you get citizen engagement and involvement then, and some more buy-in. It ain't easy, but the alternative is worse, which is that we continue to spend in, I think, 3,000 federal programs now, a $3 trillion budget on programs, money in ways that's not effective, and we just cannot afford to do that.
Let me ask you a question, Rob, before I go to Senator Warner. It would seem to me that this should be something that bipartisan coalescence ought to be pretty easy to, it's never easy, but it should be sort of a natural, because spending dollars more effectively, whether you're Democrat or Republican, is probably something that falls into the ambit of that which you believe in. And yet, it does seem very difficult to get legislation. I know you all have both been very constructive here, but it seems very difficult, even on this, which everybody should be able to agree on, to get legislation and to move forward effectively on a legislative basis.
Well, look, in the Q&A, we'll hear some of the challenges, I'm sure, because there are folks in the room who are concerned about, particularly on the benefit side, and also on the cost side, who's going to make the decision? What does this mean? Is this too subjective? And particularly on labor, environment, and some other sensitive issues, it's not easy. I'm not suggesting it's easy. But it doesn't mean that we shouldn't be doing a better job. And, just give you an example. Independent agencies, there have been, 21 major rules in the last year. We can only find only one, where there had actually been benefits assessed in any quantitative way, evidence-based way. I think there were 6 on the cost side, where you could say at least part of it was tested in terms of cost. These are, big rulemakings, $100 million or more impact. So we got a long way to go. I'm not suggesting there aren't issues that are going to come up and there are friction points at some point in the process, but frankly, the opportunities are so great right now to just have the government work, again, more effectively, more efficiently for the taxpayer dollars that are going to become increasingly scarce. We look at our budget problems, and Bob has been a leader on this in looking at the mandatory side of the spending. On the discretionary side, there's more and more squeeze. And partly because we won't take on the mandatory side in a serious way, and that's going to result in us having to get that dollar stretched even further. So I think this is an area ripe for bipartisanship, and should be something that, in addition to what Mark and I are working on, that we look at in every program. John Bridgman talked earlier about the Drug-Free Communities Act, some of the stuff we've done with drug prevention. And what we were able to do at the federal level, I think is fair to say, not to be immodest as a federal official, because, look, it's not a top-down, it's sort of a bottom-up approach on drug prevention, but if they wanted the federal money, they had to go to an evidence-based approach. And guess what's happened? Literally thousands of coalitions around the country now, they're talking about data and looking at outcomes and measuring results and using metrics. And so I do think the federal government can help with regard to some of these issues, not just at the state or federal, but also state and local level, to encourage best practices, more evidence-based approaches that will help not just to save money, but actually, in this case, to help people to be able to lead fulfilling lives through getting kids, off substance abuse and through prevention and treatment. So anyway, I think that's what we hear probably later in some of the Q&A, is there are some rubs here, and yet there's a lot of opportunity.
Senator Warren, let me ask you the same question. You did this in the private sector, and then as I recollected, when you were governor of Virginia, you won an award, the name of which I don't remember, but I think it was the highest.
Best managed state in the country.
Yeah,
I can remind everybody.
I had a funny feeling. I had a funny feeling you would remember that. Okay.
Bring out the best state for business. I can bring them out all out if you'd like.
So
Just haven't had
Wonder
my
for
back
governor
pocket
campaign
right
starting.
Oh, you're running again for governor, Rob said. I'll leave that between you and Rob. If you take your private sector experience and you take your state experience, and the state you must have had the same problem, which I actually was going to ask Rob about, didn't have a chance to, or didn't think to the initial question, which is there's an asymmetry, it seems to me, for state employees or federal employees, which is that if you do something and it works, there's a limit on what you can get in terms of incentives and rewards. And if you do something and it fails, as I can remember from my own experience, there are all sorts of potential negatives. So that is a symmetry you don't have in the private sector. So having taken all that and put it together, what are the lessons you think can be taken from your private sector and your state experience that relate to trying to make this constructive and real, as opposed to paper shuffling and paper filling and the like?
Yeah, great question. And thank you, Bob, for you and the Hamilton Project and American Cheese for doing this. And good to be with Alan, but also particularly with Rob. Rob and I have got a lot of things that we are working together on. I do think it's a little weird to be in Washington where you find somebody of the opposite party, you work together and you're immediately called a gang member, which is bizarre. only place where gang membership is as good as Capitol Hill. You know, and on this subject,
That's funny.
and I appreciate all the good work. I want a special shout out to Michael Greenstone, who's helped educate me on just how glaring, particularly at the federal level, these challenges are. Let me start with the state process. One is, I think this stuff, and I'm so happy to see all of you here, because this kind of regulatory reform, cost-benefit analysis, or this is a fairly esoteric subject, and lots of politicians talk about it, but nobody really wants to focus on it. I remember when we, as governor, we would start leveraging all of our purchasing power and completely reform the way we did real estate, the way we did purchasing. And I brought out the fact that we lowered the price of light bulbs in Virginia from 33 cents to 22 cents. It doesn't seem a lot, but we buy a hell of a lot of light bulbs in the Commonwealth of Virginia. But after the first kind of round of press announcements, as I would go back and try to generate more interest in this subject from legislators or the press, you got a big giant yawn and eyes glazing over. And I think it then becomes even harder, as you said, at the federal level or particularly state level like Virginia, where we have this crazy rule where you rotate governors every 4 years. If you're trying to come in and say to your state workforce, hey, I really mean it, they say, this guy will go, and it'll be gone. And what we found in Virginia was, it took me 2 years to realize that simply sending out executive orders, whether it wasn't enough. Only way I could actually get it was whether it was minority business procurement, whether it was results in our high schools. I literally had every line item manager report up on a weekly report on their performance metric. And for example, every principal in high schools around the Commonwealth had to report on what they were doing for those students who were falling through the cracks. So we, at some point you kind of got folks and they say, oh my gosh, they really mean it this time. And I think it actually can empower the workforce. At the federal level, this problem is exponentially harder because the enterprise is so much larger. I remember when I first got here, kind of on the budget committee, which I didn't realize at first how little input that actually has. Maybe oxymoron to say budget committee in Congress. But I thought, well, let me take the low-hanging fruit. We tried to identify those OMB programs that both the Bush administration and Obama administration had identified for elimination. I thought, shouldn't be anything hard about this. 16 programs, $1 billion. Man, you thought I'd asked to do, for the destruction of the whole federal government. The amount of blowback I got from both sides saying even though both Bush and Obama had agreed these programs ought to go, it was hard to get traction. We did, I will say, 3 years, 4 years later, we've got 11 out of the 16 gone, because many of them sounded great. Many of them in areas that I care deeply about. Public broadcasting were 4 programs. Finally got the public broadcast guys and said, I've always been a supporter, but behind closed doors they acknowledge, well, maybe these do need to go. But there's a kind of not a sexiness to this. I would raise the littlest bill that nobody's ever heard of that I believe will build on the good work that Rob and others did with PART and every one of these kind of management reforms, something called GIPRA, the Government Performance Results and Modernization Act, which to my mind does 3 things that are important if we're going to elevate this kind of evidence-based discussion. One is it says to every government agency, every government program, if you've got 30 or 40 goals, you don't have any goals. If you can't limit your priorities to 3 to 5, and and let's face it, Congress is the worst at continuing to add on, then we're really, you're not going to have focus. So to try to limit your goals and objectives from a management standpoint, which always is the tail on the budget dog, management is always the secondary thought, to a more focused level, number 1. Number 2, it does say, to your point, how do you take, and we said, let's start eliminating some of these reporting requirements. We are always additive in Congress on a regulatory standpoint. I want to come back to that in the second round of questions. But on just a reporting standpoint, is you keep adding, you never take away. So we said we got to at least eliminate 10% of reporting requirements. And now we've got GAO come out recently with a 300-odd different reporting requirements that ought to be eliminated. So showing back to the federal workforce that, hey, we're going to actually, if we add, also subtract makes some sense. And then finally, what we did with this legislation, and this was the hardest, and candidly, OMB fought us on this one, which was to say to agencies, okay, you have to identify within your policy area not only your top performing programs, but your least performing programs. You talk about something that's a radical thought. Now, OMB usually gets stuck with that task. But to really push an agency head, an agency manager to identify which programs that he or she thinks is getting the least value for the dollar, that, everyone wants to talk about their good kids. Nobody wants to talk about their challenge kids. We're now 3 years into this, Amy, right? And we're yet to get that list. I think it's supposed to be coming.
No, we got it.
We've got it now, just come recently. That's the last 30 days. Jeff Science and I
That's
have
30
fun.
seconds.
Yeah, I know. But I think this area is going to become of increasing importance. I agree with Rob that we've got to deal with the mandatory programs, or we're going to continue to squeeze discretionary spending. I also think we have to deal with the revenue side of the house. You can't take $4.5 trillion out of the revenue stream and double defense spending, go to war, aging population, without putting some of that revenue stream back in. But regardless of that, if we don't do both sides of this, my fear is, from Bob, your background as Treasury Secretary in the private sector, if we don't have a growth component of our economy, then all the taxing and cutting in the world isn't going to get us there. And the challenge I have, and again, taking off my partisan hat, but just from a business guy standpoint, the approach that has come out of the House that would cut domestic discretionary spending from about 16% of our federal spend down to less than 5%, I would never have invested in a company that spent less than 5% of its revenues on its workforce, infrastructure, and R&D. It is not a business plan that would be competitive in the world economy, and no other industrial country in the world has that business plan. So, I think it again forces us back to this question of how we get better value for our dollar and the good work that you guys are doing with this report.
How broadly, let me ask the question to both of you, because I think you both sort of said the same thing. It seems to me it's unambiguously, unarguably right that we've got to get a better use of our money when you have such limited resources. Do your colleagues relate to this? And are you going to when you legislate, are you going to be able to include in that legislation some little piece for evaluation? Will there be a willingness to engage in evidence-based evidence and more broadly cost-benefit evaluation up front? Or will we do things the way we usually do and often have legislation being affected by lobbying interests, special interests? The allocation of infrastructure, for example, is enormously reduced, the rate of return on federal infrastructure that you would have if it were done on an economically rational basis.
Yeah, I mean, I must
The question is
say
how
that,
your colleagues relate to all this.
I think our colleagues are open to it. I mean, I think there's an appetite for it. I don't think there's a lot of work that's been done on it, frankly. We had Secretary Sebelius before the Finance Committee today, and I was asking her, about this issue, the mandatory spending side. So moving from the domestic programs you're talking about to our important but unsustainable entitlement programs. And the question was, what has worked in Part D that got the cost down relative to what we thought it was going to be? It's down about 40%. The last 3 years, OMB has said it's $100 billion less they thought it was going to be. What is that? Is that competition? Is it some of the governmental mandates that have been in place in terms of negotiating? And so that's, I mean, honestly, it will be easier, I think, on the domestic side for Mark and I to promote this kind of legislation we've talked about, where you look at cost benefit, you look at the least burdensome way to get there, you look at ways to do more with less. More difficult on the mandatory side. It's now 65% of the budget and the fastest growing part. Those important programs growing over 100% probably in the next 10 years, according to CBO, 95%, but probably more. So that's really the same discussion we're having, although it's harder, which is to say, what are the outcomes? Instead of paying a doctor for volume or input, what is the actual measurement of quality of care coming out at the other end? And obviously this is something that we will continue to struggle with. I'm sure Alan will have some thoughts on this. I know CBO has been struggling with it. But if we don't get to that issue, all of the good work that we're talking about today, as important as it is on the domestic discretionary side, maybe for naught, because we may have to make such major adjustments in those programs that it won't be a matter of saving 20 cents on the dollar. It'll be cutting that dollar by 25 cents in order to accommodate all this other spending that is on autopilot. So I may be not answering your question precisely, except to say this is also about receptivity on the part of our colleagues, Democrat, Republican alike, because nobody wants to touch this area, to be honest with you. People say Republicans can't wait to go up after mandatory spending. Not true. It's the third rail of American politics, that electrified one in the New York subway system, that you don't want to grab. But we've got to figure this out also, the same empirical, data-based approach on healthcare, because if we don't do that, the important healthcare programs, which by the way together grow 110% over the next 10 years based on CBO, will swamp the rest of the budget.
Actually, yeah, go ahead, Mark, and then we're going to talk to Alan. Alan is one of the world's leading authorities in evidence-based decision-making. But listen, it's interesting. I mean, you all very quickly relate evidence-based decision-making, cost-benefit analysis to the entitlement area, which is true, and the revenue area, and it's sort of all one package, even though we were focusing really on more on the discretionary side of the budget, I guess, than anything else. But of course, you're right, they all relate to each other.
Well, I think, let me just try to answer it as well. I think there is an opportunity here, but I think an area that should not be kind of full of partisan or ideological difference. You're talking about real, true evidence. Who could be against that? Data-driven decision-making. But, we do have to have, I think in both political parties, there's a group on the Republican side who says that every new program by definition must be bad, and every regulation, additional regulation by definition must be bad. And you've got, I think, overreactions that say then, so let's get rid of all regulations, or let's have moratoriums regardless of what science tells us. On the other side, on my side, you've got people who say, even that might privately acknowledge this program has outlived its usefulness, but because it's got a good title description, means that you can never get rid of it, or if you try to change any regulations, thousands of small children are going to fall through the cracks. Both of those are old-style thinking. And so I think, from both program outcomes and regulatory, there's three buckets. There are three areas we need to address. And Rob and I are working on one of them. One is, how do you do the cost-benefit analysis on the front end, both regulatory and programmatically? Who does it? And where should that be housed? Second is, and this is again something that Michael educated me on, how rarely, if ever, we ever go back 3 or 5 years after the fact to see, did the regulation ever achieve its goals? Because quite honestly, right now, I don't lead the agencies or industry on any subject, because I think both are cooking the books. But we've never gone back on an evidence-based say, well, did that environmental regulation, that safety regulation, did it really cost $1 gazillion or save 1 million lives? There's no retrospective look. And then finally, to the point that you raised, Bob, and this is one that I had some ideas on that have been shot down quickly that I'm not even sure Rob will go with. How do you kind of get the incentives right so that good working people inside the government who have no benefit by taking anything away, can only get criticized by taking anything away, have no incentive to say, well, if I can get 90% of the value at 98% of the cost versus 75% of the value for 30% of the cost, they're always going to go with the higher regulation because there's no downside to them on incentivizing, so the Brits have got this one in, one out theory. You add a regulation, take one away, that, stirs a lot of controversy, but is a realignment of incentives that could be part of the discussion. So I put those, pre-cost benefit analysis, post-retrospective review, and then try to how do you align the incentives so that folks inside government who are operationalizing the laws we pass have got the right balance.
I would think if you could solve the last part, Mark, it would be responsive to the problem of how do you avoid just being paper filling out as opposed to being real. Alan, you're one of the global, universally recognized experts on evidence-based, evidence-informed decision-making. You're agreeing with me?
Well, until you got to the base part. I'm an expert on evidence. I'll accept that.
Let me ask you this. When you take a look at the use of evidence, as we're discussed, it would seem imperatively important to move forward in this. How do you deal with some of the issues that people raise? For example, evidence doesn't measure non-quantifiable factors, the value of human life, or I happen to be a fly fisherman, so the value of a great stream or a wonderful stream and preserving it. how do you deal with the question, I think Rob may have mentioned it, of who interprets this data and how it gets interpreted and how do you avoid people bringing other agendas to the interpretation? Data can often be ambiguous. And so how do you deal with that and what other questions other issues you might like to identify so that we can really make effective and fully informed and fully constituented, if there was such a word, which there isn't, but use of all this that takes into account all of the factors that should be taken into account.
It's a great question. It's one I grapple with all the time on my job. I don't need to tell you, Bob, that we live in an uncertain world, and we have to...
Yeah, that's a book that I published and is still available in paperback.
1-800.
No, you just call Amazon, that's okay.
And there will always be a certain level of uncertainty that we can't reduce. But it doesn't mean that we shouldn't make the best decisions that we can make given the information that we have. So on your first point, how do we quantify, or what do we do about things that we think we can't quantify? In some sense, progress in science involves quantifying what was previously unquantifiable. So take the value of human life, which is a subject which is awfully hard to think about. Usually you think that's something that philosophers should think about. But if you're thinking about regulations, which reduce casualties, and there's a cost to those regulations, you have to put the benefits on the other side. And to make coherent choices, to make consistent choices across regulations, what one needs is an estimate of the value of reducing the risk. And there, I think economists have been ingenious. Going back to Adam Smith, in The Wealth of Nations, Smith explained why wages vary across workers, and one of his explanations was some jobs are more dangerous than others. He used as an example, coal miners are paid more than blacksmiths, even though being a blacksmith is a higher skilled job, because coal miners face much greater risk, and they also work in those times underground. So what economists have done is to try to look at what's the price that the market places on risk. One way to do that is by looking at the labor market. How much is the compensating wage differential for accepting a job which carries a greater risk? Then what one can do is extrapolate from that. The risk of fatality on a job may be 1% on one job, 2% on another job, to extrapolate from the income differentials associated with those risks, holding other factors constant, to the value of a statistical life. Now, not surprisingly, you get a range of estimates when you do this. You can also do it in other ways. You could look at, one of Michael's teachers, my colleague, Worley Ashenfelter, looked at driving behavior. And if you drive at a faster speed, it increases the chance of a fatal accident. How much time do you save? What's that worth? So there are other ways of getting a value of risk. And the estimates range from roughly $5 million for a statistical life to $9 million, which in the scheme of estimates is not all that wide. There are inconsistencies across agencies about what value they use. And some of those differences might make some sense if you're talking about people who are at different ages, different groups. But some of that variability to an economist doesn't make that much sense. So one way to, I think, improve our regulations is to have more uniformity across those kinds of evaluations. But I don't want to leave you with the impression that these estimates are easy. There are lots of potential confounding factors. Even when there are experiments done, the gold standard, when we could use randomized assignment, there are threats to the evaluations. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't do them, and we shouldn't use them to inform our decisions, along with other information that affects government policy. One thing I would highlight, and I think this is an evolution building on the progress from when Senator Portman was at OMB, is in our budget, we're very clear about requirements for agencies to set priority goals. They're listed on the web. If you go to performance.gov, the goals are there. The accountable person who's responsible for trying to meet that goal is there. Description of the strategies that they're using and progress they're making towards those goals. And some of those goals will affect mandatory programs like reducing hospital-based infections by 25% for some of the key infections. That's one of the goals I noticed that HHS has set. So we're trying to use the evidence that's out there comes in lots of different forms. Some of it's stronger than others. When the evidence is stronger, we should put more weight on it. Where it's weak, we need to develop better evidence. But what the administration has been trying to do in grant making to support more grants in areas where the evidence supports the kinds of programs that people are applying for, and then to develop better evidence in other areas, we're trying to use this approach to influence the way that the government is operating. And not only will that, I think, make better uses of our resources, I think it should give the public more confidence that the government is a good steward of their dollars, that we're trying to deliver the best services we can for their hard-earned tax dollars.
Let me add one more piece to that, Alan. How do you deal with the question of timelines in measuring, particularly in benefits, I suppose, no, in costs too, in both of them? You have short-term costs, you have long-term costs and benefits are highly unpredictable at best. How do you incorporate the question of timeframes in your cost-benefit analysis?
Well, it would be similar to what a business would do. When you have costs up front and then you get revenue stream down the road, you need to discount the future. And there are standards for how one discounts. There's a big debate among economists what discount rate is the appropriate one for environmental damage, things like that. The other thing I would mention is as you get new evidence, what you want to do is use it. John Maynard Keynes once had this great line when someone asked him, last week you argued the opposite.
Yes.
He said, when I get new evidence, I use it. What do you do with it? We're trying to continually integrate the evidence that's coming in. So it's not all evaluation work, and some of the evidence is more exploring the data and seeing where it looks like there were bottlenecks. And then the last thing I want to mention is I think the point is well taken that we do regulations prospectively when it's much harder. You know, to calculate the cost of something which hasn't been put in place or the benefits. The president signed an executive order called the Look Back Initiative, which encourages the public to submit regulations that they think, given the experience that we've had, no longer meet the benefit cost test, and encourage agencies to review their regulations and say which ones are no longer necessary, either because we've learned more in the meantime or because technology has changed, so there are cheaper ways of accomplishing the same goals. And there indeed have been some regulations that have been rolled back.
Do you have a sense, Alan, and then I have questions for two of the senators, but do you have a sense, I'm aware of where the look back, that was I think an executive order 2011, if I remember correctly. Do you have a sense of how effective that has been, either rolling back, which is as you just described, or in changing regulations or not putting forth regulations prospectively?
I can't give you a total for the cost of the regulations that were rolled back, but there were some significant ones. One I remember is de-icing of airplanes and how the fluids that's used to de-ice the airplanes is disposed of was significant savings for airlines. What has surprised me a little bit is when I go around and I talk to groups, and sometimes I hear general complaints about regulations, I point out that the president signed this executive order. One of the things, this is my suggestion, you don't expect this from economists, but I recommended to Cass Sunstein that he do a video explaining this, a YouTube video, and it went viral, which means that maybe 1,000 people watched it. So I don't think...
Half of them are in this room. So.
So I think we probably need to do a better job getting the word out that this is something that we are open to.
Can I add one thing on that?
You can do whatever you like.
That, I've found the same as somebody who comes from a private sector background and a state background where we pride ourselves as being very pro-business friendly. So I have kind of fall more on the line of prove it to me before we simply add on more regulations. One of the things I've found curious as I sit with lots and lots of business groups, and I was looking at regulatory reform, how rarely, though, you could get any business group to say, all right, what would you actually, give us the list of what you want gotten rid of.
Yeah.
And I don't know if that's a case of, well, was it because they've already built in the cost and adjusted their processes to get used to it? Was it the case that these regulations were not nearly as nefarious and costly as they projected, and said beforehand? But I have been surprised, quite honestly, that as I've tried to solicit this, that there's not been, it's been in the tens, not in the hundreds or thousands of regulations.
It's an interesting comment, Mark. Something that struck me, I really hadn't thought about it until I was talking to Michael about something. If there was any way of substantially increasing the focus on this in the culture of both private sector and the public sector, the savings could be enormous. And then that would be responsive to a lot of the questions of how do you deal with the politics, how do you deal with the incentives, and so forth. Rob, I remember when we used to deal with you when you were a member of the House, and you were very thoughtful, and even when we disagreed, you had reasons, and you actually responded with reasons as opposed to just disagreement.
We actually disagreed sometimes.
We did, but you were a reasonable and sensible person. It's possible you even right sometimes. But as you take your experience at OMB and you look at the federal government, and you think of how much more effectively we could function. If you were king, what would you do?
Wow. Mark mentioned the private sector. I mean, one thing would be, without being critical of what the Obama administration has done on look back, is to bring that private sector mentality into the government at every level. It can't just be OMB. OMB has got a very important role here, but as you know, the agencies have to be willing to go along with it. And I think if Cass were here, or even Jack Lew were here, he would say that some of this look back has been challenging with some of the agencies. I mean, frankly, there's one in particular, won't name any names, you know, I'm on the Government Affairs Committee, and, you know, when we asked this question you asked earlier, it's like, well, we've had this progress here and there, but this agency, you know, there's a lot of pushback. So it has to be cultural, but every major company in America, and most smaller companies, given what's happened in the last 4 years particularly, have had to do this if they weren't already doing it, which means look at their efficiencies, look at their expenses, figuring out how to do more with less. Unfortunately, it's meant, in many cases, more technology that leads to fewer workers, but it has increased productivity, which is one of our challenges, as you know, on our employment side. So that is the general answer. But I do think, as I said earlier, although we'll probably in the Q&A hear about some specific concerns people have on some of the cost-benefit analysis, particularly on the benefit side, how to quantify it and so on. You know, you mentioned the value of a statistical life. I'm always looking, what's that statistical life, you know? Every life is different, but let me give you one example. Right now, I am working with Mike Bennett on worker retraining. We introduced legislation last year, and it's down Warner's alley, so I'll have to get Mark engaged too. But it says, okay, there are 47 different worker retraining programs in the federal government. They're spread over 9 different agencies and departments. The GAOs looked at this and said that only 5 of them have been subject to any outcome analysis, meaning any really evidence-based analysis, since 2003. So we spend between $15 and $18 billion on this. It's not pocket change, it's substantial expense. And there's just very little information out there. So for those who say, gosh, you know, the government's already doing this and so on, I mean, if I were king, I'd say something like that. Now, we're putting in place some pilot programs. That's the best we could do on a bipartisan basis, to be frank, to look at some of these programs and force them to be accountable, meaning giving states the flexibility to require accountability. What are your outcomes? Longitudinal studies. What happened 2 years, 5 years, 6 years out? Did you actually get someone a job? You know, were you connected with the industries in your local region? I see some of you shaking your heads. No, they weren't. You know, because some of you are involved in this workforce training. It's very, as I look at it back in Ohio, it is dependent on the local community, really, and the relationships almost between the business community and the community college or the career center or whatever. But there is a lot of waste and inefficiency of these dollars. And at a time when we have 100,000 people in Ohio looking for a worker, 100,000 jobs available, and 400,000 people looking for work, what a great place for the federal government to say, we can spend this, in the case of Ohio, $250 billion much more effectively, because we spend $275 million in Ohio on this every year. So, where I king, I go into these kind of programs, you know, where you see big dollars, and big effects, and then the other one, of course, is healthcare. When I left OMB, I was asked by the reporters, what did you learn during your time there? And I wasn't there very long, I admit. I wish I'd been able to be there longer, but the question was, what did you learn? You know, was it the wars? Was it the tax cuts? You know, is it the inefficiency in government? What is really our biggest fiscal problem? And I had to say, you know, it's healthcare. And when I was there, I tried to hire more people. At one point, someone said to me, Rob, you know, 25% of your employees ought to be in healthcare, and it was about 9%. And they were right in the sense that if we don't solve this problem and apply some of these same principles, not to get back to that same point, that whether it's federal retirement health care, whether it's Medicare, whether it's Medicaid, dealing with these issues has to be a priority if we're to deal with this larger fiscal problem that we face.
Or the overall healthcare system.
And in the private sector healthcare system, great point, because we're seeing a little sticker shock now and will for the next 9 months, I believe, and this is affecting our competitiveness. So were I king, I'd put a lot of focus there.
Let's open it up to everybody. Who would like to, well, let's see. About halfway back. Why don't you stand up, say who you are, who you're with. Are there microphones? Yeah. Well, maybe they're not. Why don't you just yell?
All right. My name is Paulette Lee, and I'm a communications consultant. And whereas I work primarily in international development and would be interested in asking your opinions about applying evidence-based to that area of allocation, it occurs to me I'd rather ask how you would use cost-benefits analysis in terms of deciding whether or not to go to war.
Oh. Would any, well, that's probably a somewhat complicated question. Would anybody like to take that on?
I think that's Alan. Is
Yeah.
evidence-based.
Alan? Alan does look like he wants to respond. Go ahead.
I think economists.
I hate to admit I actually wrote something on this once. Trying to do a benefit cost analysis of the Iraq War. And I was citing work by professors at University of Chicago when I used to write for the New York Times. I summarized the benefit cost.
Oh, you better talk up.
Anyway, what you do is you try to identify the benefits and the costs.
That's how you do that's how you do your cost benefit analysis?
That's the way it starts. And value and security is hard, but obviously if you reduce future risks to our national security, that's a benefit. And the costs are also hard to quantify because they can grow over time. You know, you look at the Vietnam War and the veterans' disabilities that we're learning about were related to exposure that the veterans had there. That's taken quite a bit of time to estimate. I wanted to go back to one thing which came up earlier about the value of statistical life. Everybody's life is different, which is obviously correct. Where we do better is at estimating averages. We do pretty well when we look at training programs and saying on average what are the benefits from the Job Corps program, and there was a major study that was funded in the early 2000s to look at Job Corps. Where we do less well and where we, I think, need to do more analysis is, well, why does this center do better than that center? Why does this community college do a lot better than that community college? Why does this hospital seem to do a lot better than that hospital? And that's a harder question to raise. For one thing, you have many fewer observations. You only have a certain number of people at each hospital or each Job Corps center as opposed to 20,000 in the full sample. So you can look at groups and you can say, is this program more effective for that group, which is something that I think we learned from Job Corps, that the older participants benefited more. But one of the things which OMB is trying to do is to use the data that's coming in from the programs to say, what are the best practices? Why does it seem that recidivism is lower in this, from this prison or that prison? Why does it seem that crime rates are lower on this reservation than that reservation? And to build that in, and there's, I think, a lot of potential on the healthcare side to save money there.
Any question other than going to war? Yes, sir. I'll try the front of the room. Maybe we'll see if we come out there.
Thanks. In domestic social policy,
You might say who you are and who you're with.
John Barron with the Coalition for Evidence-Based Policy. In domestic social policy, the administration has been advancing a number of major evidence-based initiatives in areas like employment and training and K-12 education and crime prevention, which are described very thoughtfully in the president's budget and have high evidence standards. And the Bush administration advanced some of the earlier pilots for this in home visiting and elsewhere. But one area in the president's agenda that seems to be an evidence-free zone is in healthcare financing and delivery. There was a recent report by GAO that found that the CMS Center for Innovation, which is trying all sorts of new innovations on how to pay hospitals for performance and so on, are using methods like propensity scores and other things which have been shown not to be particularly rigorous and in some cases to produce unreliable methods. The same thing is true in all of the waivers that are going forward in...
Let me ask you this. How would you reduce that? That's a very thoughtful observation.
Yes.
How would you reduce it to a question?
reduce it to a question is what gives? I guess what's happening? Why is this area of important area of domestic social policy not using rigorous approaches that are going forward in other areas?
Rob, you mentioned healthcare before. Would you like to start on that?
And defend the administration? Look, I
meant in a broader sense.
I tend to agree with the question, understanding that this is not easy, and there is some subjectivity to it. Some of you are aware of the Dartmouth Atlas, where they show what Alan refers to as, a statistical imbalance, where you have areas of the country where costs are so much lower than others, and some so much higher than others. And these are hospitals treating people of the same sort of age cohort. There's you can sort of equalize it to get an apples-to-apples comparison. Still, you have these big differences. What we haven't done is that next step. Okay, how do you take these best practices and apply them so that in Minneapolis, where actually costs are relatively low for the same procedure as Miami, you figure out why in Miami these costs are so much higher. And by the way, these are not just because there are more seniors in Miami, because they can adjust for that. So I think there's a huge opportunity there. In terms of these programs generally on the healthcare side, you're right. I mean, if you look at the proposals that came out in the President's budget recently, there is some discussion, as you know, of, for instance, more means testing. There's some discussion of Part A and Part B coming together. There's some things obviously being done in terms of the accurate measure of inflation, which would be the change CPI discussion. So I'm not suggesting there's nothing in there that affects the mandatory side, but there is not this rigorous analysis. So maybe it's a better question for Alan, but I think it's an area, as I said earlier, that we're going to have to address, because the consequences of not addressing it, given our current economy, given our current budget situation, based on all the forecasts that we've seen, would indicate you're going to have a shrinking part of the budget that Bob cares a lot about: research, education, national security, and so on.
Let me just jump in here on this too. One, I'm back on workforce. I absolutely can agree with Rob. I was governor, tried to rationalize our workforce programs. It was a great campaign line, but you couldn't rationalize them because there were all these federal funding flows that retarded your ability to consolidate and localize. And actually, some of the work that your project has done recently in terms of just being able to publicize data that shows, 3 years at UVA versus a associate's degree at a community college. It's better to get 2 years with the associate's degree, or even 1 year in certification, than 3 years at a UVA if you don't finish. So there's lots of kind of the ability to just price what's in the market and show to folks. I mean, I can show you more high schools around Virginia where you have a huge preponderance of folks in the career and technical education, particularly women, in cosmetology programs. We don't need that many cosmetologists, yet you don't price out all of the other things. So there's data that they'll get out, and I think there'll be some consolidation efforts here. I actually, think around healthcare, as somebody who voted for the Affordable Care Act because while imperfect, I knew the status quo was going to bankrupt us. Think that there was a lot of effort to try to, in that legislation, to move away from fee-for-service, based into outcome-based medicine. We had a series of amendments, a group of the freshman senators, it was the only ones that were bipartisan, to try to push more ability to experiment on cost containment. I think we could have gone further, candidly. But I think some of the pushback, and I would agree, I think Rob I'll give full credit to the administration here, to put out change CPI, to put about consolidation of Medicare Part A and B into a single deductible, so you've everybody got some skin on the game on every component, so there's not this kind of mishmash of copays some areas and not in others. And I think, having spent a lot of time with Secretary Sebelius in Maryland Taverner, who I think is trying to push, I think there's some resistance that is more kind of institutional CMS based and the actual healthcare system based than it is the administration trying to kind of push new, more cutting edge models. So.
If I can just add a little bit. I guess I don't accept the premise. I think the ACA did take into account research that was available. If you look at readmission rates for hospitals, the incentives have changed and readmission rates have declined considerably since ACA passed. Healthcare costs remain, I think, our primary budget problem. But if you look at CBO's forecasts, they've lowered them over the past few years. And I think
lowered to the point of about, from when Simpson Bowles came out You know, and I don't know whether this is recession, Obamacare, or
Behavioral.
fairy dust, but it's $500 billion less on the 10-year projection line for Medicare than it was 3 years ago. So that's, you know, that's fairly seasonable.
And it doesn't look like it's all recession
Well, that's
because
the
it
question.
continued after the recession ended. And when we look across states, the areas where the recession was less bad also had a commensurate drop in their healthcare costs. So I think there is something that's changing in practices. Also, there was the effort to have the IPAB, which would try to develop evidence on cost effectiveness. I wanted to say one other thing about the budget. You know, what I think the president's budget does is it demonstrates that we can get on a fiscally sustainable path while at the same time make key investments. And those key investments were a result of evidence. Preschool for all. You know, the work that was done on the Perry preschool program and Abecedarian and other non-experimental studies, I think, helped to inform the biggest new initiative in the president's budget.
Yes, ma'am. Is there a microphone? Good.
This has been a great discussion, thank you. I'm Mitzi Wertheim with the Naval Postgraduate School. As a citizen, I wish the government informed us better about all the things you're doing. I worked for the Center for Naval Analysis, a think tank, and we always had to put out thick reports. Nobody ever read them because nobody has any time. I think Congress should require that for all reports that are not classified, they do what the National Intelligence Council just did, which they did their 2030 report. They put it into a 2-pager, and you can know what were the ideas, and if you want to go then read 80 or 100 pages, you can do it. The fact that you do so many good things and none of us know about it because you drown it with so many words, that's a really, it's a hard job to get it concise. But there are people that can do that, and I think you owe it to
Not
us.
politicians.
Yeah, I was thinking the same. I was thinking the same thing. Decided it was impolite to say it. I guess that's
I'm going to give you a copy
yeah.
of it.
But it's a good question. Why do you all think that there isn't more, or do you think there should be, or could be, or how would it get done?
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, there are too many reports required, in my view. And, you know, it's, now that I'm on the Senate side of it rather than the administration side of it, you know, you have a little different perspective, and I'm trying to maintain some objectivity and say, there's just too many reports
They're
required.
also too long.
And they're too long, and people don't read them. In fact, members of Congress don't read them. And their staff don't even read them often, because it's easy to say, do another report rather than legislating. It's sort of like a way to get around doing maybe what you ought to be doing, which is requiring something, or letting it go. So that's one, in my view. And there's some data on that, by the way, in terms of the number of reports, increasing reports that have been required, and Bob had deals with Treasury. But two, you know, it's not only that it's important, if the tax dollars are going into it, that we see this information, some of it's very useful, but it makes a difference when citizens see it. So when I was at OMB, we put all earmarks online, which made me very unpopular with my former colleagues. Luckily, by the time I got back into the legislative branch, there was then a sense there'd be no earmarks, so I wasn't blamed as much. But at the time, it was sort of, this was 2005 or 6, it was something that people really objected to. The result was a lot fewer earmarks because citizens had access to where these earmarks were by zip code, which identified them, and they had to know, and we also had to identify, you know, what the agency or department was, or nonprofit, NGO that received it, how much, and so on, and that had a salutary effect. Grants and contracts. I've actually gone back to try to figure out what the impact was, and maybe Mark Brown can talk to this, but this was actually a Coburn Obama bill that was done in 2006 also, and we put at OMB all grants and contracts, I think it was over $10 million online. And what an amazing treasure trove of information for people who care, which is people in this room and about 500 more we figured out. No, but really, I mean, people back home, wow, I didn't realize, you know, that this is where this money was being spent, this program, this grant. So I think it really is, it's part of taking advantage of this incredible online resource we have now, you know, to be able to allow citizens access to good information. I think there ought to be fewer reports, but I think we ought to use the information that's out there already, you know, what is the government spending and how is it spending it, and let citizens see it, and it will have a salutary effect.
Let me
Mark?
give you 3 specific suggestions. One is GAO just came out with a report that showed 300 plus reports that ought to be eliminated. I got legislation that would eliminate most of those. You know, let's do it. Let's not just take the suggestion. Let's actually do it. Secondly, I go back to my little Kipper bill where, I think the idea of that kind of short report, good idea, but the notion, and Alan has mentioned, the administration is starting to do this, if an agency or program has only got 3 to 5 goals, those ought to be fairly clearly identified, and if we actually have a review, not just from OMB, but from the agency itself, of those programs that are overperforming and underperforming, that will at least spur more debate. First time ever it's happened, it's just recently, and we need to get it out. Third, it's just out now. It's in the last, Amy said, the last 30 days it's going to, so we got to get it out, y'all. Third is, we've got legislation, and Rob and I have been talking about this as well, called data that would build upon this Obama Coburn report that says, let's make sure we not only follow the money, and actually Treasury has been pretty good at this, but let's make sure that we have it in a way that's more clearly understandable, and what is in one category a grant, in another category an expenditure, needs to true up. There are 2,000 separate financial systems just inside DOD. Now, we're not going to, I learned business accounting and I learned state government accounting. I don't think I ever am going to have the time to learn federal budgeting accounting. But, it is an arcane art to kind of hide the ball. This data bill says let's take the next step on transparency and at least start to see if we could do some consolidation of some of these financial systems so we really are comparing apples to apples. Coburn, Obama, great first step. This is the next iteration of it.
We have time for one more question, and then I'm going to ask half a question. So why don't we, yes, sir.
Larry Checo Communications. Data costs money, and we're in a budget austerity time now. How much, and before we were talking about nonprofits, I've been working with nonprofits for 30 years. They're just struggling to keep their doors open, a lot of them. When I talk to them about collecting data to create their stories, they just don't get it. Not that they don't get it, but they just don't have the manpower. On the national level, is there a lot of blowback in Congress for this? In other words, nobody wants to fund this kind of research for data?
It's a very good question. Yes, Alan.
In some sense, doing research, evaluation, and collecting data are public goods. And the private sector doesn't provide enough public goods. I think we see that in a number of areas. When it comes to data, the federal government has just barely been keeping up with the changes in the economy. One of the things that we've been trying to do in the Obama administration is take more advantage of the administrative data that are coming in. This does not impose additional burdens on the private sector. And there are some restrictions. So one of the things that we support in the budget is an act called Data Sync, which would allow the Census Bureau and Bureau of Labor Statistics, under appropriate confidentiality, privacy restrictions, to be able to sync up their data through data that's coming in through IRS. And the IRS data is the basis for a number of the surveys, and there is potentially some redundancies so we can improve the quality of the data. So there are some things that can be done at very little cost, if any cost, which will help to improve evaluation and improve the quality of the key economic statistics that businesses and households rely so much on.
Let me take advantage of this. Oh, did you say what?
I just wanted to comment briefly on the nonprofit side. Before I got in this business, I helped start something here in Greater Washington called Venture Philanthropy Partners. And it was to try to help build the infrastructure of a lot of nonprofits. I know every nonprofit wants to spend that extra dollar helping that additional kid, but candidly, they're wasting a lot of money. You think it's hard to consolidate in the federal government area? You got to look at consolidation in nonprofit world, where we never eliminate anything. And I honestly believe we're going to have the kind of rigor that's starting to be expected at the governmental level in the nonprofit sector as well.
All right, I'm told I have a minute and a half left. Let me ask half a question. And it occurred to me as I was listening to all this, is there any way to separate the question of evidence-based, evidence-informed decision-making, cost-benefit analysis, from the larger debates about theories of the case with respect to growth, theories of the case with respect to revenues, theories of the case with respect to entitlements, so that Congress and the administration, for that matter, can put in place measures that promote evidence-based decision-making independent of the debates, the larger debates, which are so stifling our political system today?
I'll give you a half answer.
That was a half question, so that's a fair.
Again, I go to an example because I think it's, for this group, you know, you want to hear specifics, but during the budget debate, you may recall, for those of you who were up at 3:30 in the morning watching it, which is probably half of you, but there was discussion of having more evidence, as you mentioned taxes, on what the impact is of tax changes, specifically tax reform. And the question was on an amendment that I offered that Mark was actually very helpful with in committee, although I don't think we were able to get it out of the committee on a bipartisan vote. But the notion is to have the way that the Joint Tax Committee typically analyzes tax legislation as the official score. And that includes some behavioral changes, but not the macroeconomic changes. So the behavioral changes that come from the macroeconomic side, which Bob has spent a lot of time on, are important to know. And the amendment simply said that we, as members of Congress, would have information, both as we are analyzing what tax reform to use, because the next year, many of us hope there will be a solution to this budget crisis, and it will include entitlement reform and tax reform, but also, as it's working through the legislative process, to have a score that's the alternative score based on macroeconomics. Not wild dynamic scores maybe from the outside, but there is a macroeconomic model that's used by the Joint Tax Committee, Joint Committee on Taxation, and by the Congressional Budget Office. And the Joint Committee on Taxation uses 3 different models, argue which model is best, but I think we need that information. We don't have it now. In the end, on the floor of the Senate, in a very partisan atmosphere, we actually enacted it. Now, it's just in the budget, so it's not binding because the President doesn't sign it, it's not a law. But I thought it was a good step forward. And again, I'm not saying replace the official score. What I'm saying is, let's get the information. And I think, actually, on the spending side, Republicans may disagree with me on this, but it'd be good to have the information. In other words, you mentioned Keynes earlier in his comments about new evidence. There's sort of a Keynesian approach that we Republicans criticize sometimes. Let's see the different models, different analysis. In other words, if you spend $1 in infrastructure, what do you get back? So I think, Bob, the answer to your question is no, those shouldn't be inconsistent. We should be able to have our ideological battles over the role of government, over the effect of tax increases, over, frankly, the degree to which we want to have an economy that spends at a certain level of GDP versus one that is more traditional to what we've done. We can have all those arguments, but both should be informed by more evidence. And I think there is, based on that vote on the floor, evidence that on a bipartisan basis that there is an eagerness to have that data.
Rob, I think that's a terrific, I'm told our time is up, but that is a terrific, terrific note to end on. Let me thank... Oh, I'm sorry, Mark, did you want to respond?
I was just going to add...
Apologies.
Time's up.
No. We would rather hear from you.
I hope that we can do this, and I'm work with Rob on this issue. I also think that this was all the rage 8 or 9 years ago at the state level. When I was governor, I remember Washington State had the real lead. We tried it in Virginia, put a council together to see what our policy goals should be. Then we could argue about how we get there, but to try to set some evidence-based standards first. And quite honestly, I have heard less about that of successful state models in the last couple of years. Maybe it's out there, and I need to be informed of that. But I think the place where this can be experimented with, where I wish we had better models of working, would be the state.
Alan, we're finished, but if you would like to...
Well, I just wanted to add, to some extent, CBO is the answer to your question, and CBO is
that's a good point.
one of the jewels of our government. On not only on infrastructure, but also on education, for example. We know that there are benefits to society as a whole that don't necessarily get reflected in the conventional budgeting. But if you look at the work that CBO does, as an economist, I continually find it to be kind of straight down the line, supported by evidence.
CBO is one of the jewels of our government. It's probably worth noting that the last 2 directors of the Congressional Budget Office have been former directors of the Hamilton Project. And with that, we thank you all for coming.